I was born in Dowagiac, Michigan, which is a little town southeast of Kalamazoo. My mother's family was from Dowagiac. My father's family was from Kalamazoo. Both had grown up and met at Western Michigan University, married there, and then he went off to the war for several years and came back. And during that time, my mother was living in an apartment owned by my grandparents. I was born on the last moment of the war. And I was born as Harry Truman was signing the peace treaty with Japan. The story was that the obstetrician was unhappy to have to deliver me because he wanted to listen to the peace signing on the radio. Both pairs of grandparents had a cabin on a lake. My mother's parents had a cabin on Indian Lake, which was great for fishing, and that's where apparently I learned to swim. My Kalamazoo parents had a cabin on Gull Lake. The grandparents bought this cabin so that their children could have time in the summertime. So we would spend a month there, and that's where I learned to water ski and swim better. We were next to some very wealthy folks who had fancy boats and fancy drag racing cars and so forth. So I just kind of followed along and became friends with those kids. My mother was very well organized. She would make things happen. My father, he wasn't much of a businessman, but he originally started a company to make and sell vinyl paint, primarily for movie screens and the hulls of racing boats, and it made it go faster. When I was in 7th grade, his company was not doing well, and he found a company in New Jersey to sell his company to, and he went along as the president of that division of the company. I'd spent all of my life in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and went to a completely foreign, for me, section of the country, the suburb of New York, basically, called Short Hills, New Jersey. The kids all came from a very different background than I was used to. So I had a little trouble, integrating myself into that environment. I kind of stood out. I was a funny-looking kid at the time. Was the butt of some jokes for 2 or 3 years. I decided in the 8th grade that I wanted to be a surgeon. I have no idea why I would make that decision. I had at that time no family members who were in medicine. I had had no contact particularly with medical problems in myself or the family. And somehow it came to me in a bolt of lightning, I guess, that I wanted to be a surgeon. I had lawyers in the family and knew about lawyers and other occupations, but I just said, well, no, I want to be a surgeon. My father was a Christian Scientist and had been having some headaches. Christian Scientists prefer not to go to doctors, or did at that time, and felt that they needed counseling by a religious counselor. We were quite close to New York, and many of the people would commute to New York, so he's found a Christian Science counselor in New York who would help him get better to the mind of God, was what they said. And finally, after about a year, he lost his vision suddenly, almost had an accident in the car, and finally went to a physician who diagnosed that he had a brain tumor, and he died about a week after that. So it was a very sudden thing at his age of 38. By that time, my father was a public relations consultant for several marine firms, and suddenly he's gone, and he's the only guy in the business. So my mother, to her great credit, took over the business. So I lost my mother's attention, as did my younger sister. It may have helped to integrate me with some of the kids in the school who felt sorry for me. When I was about 14, I think that was around the time my father died, folk music was just coming into vogue, and I had access to actually by myself take the train into to New York City with friends and go down to Greenwich Village and hear folk music and learn folk music. The high school that I was attending had a singing group, and so I was able to get a place in that. In my senior year, the high school decided they were going to have an album made. Somebody knew somebody in New York, and so we went into New York, this group, and sang cover songs, basically plagiarism of the Kingston Trio and others like that, and distributed it just around the high school. And it was fun. We had pictures of us, and people would come to us for autographs and so forth. So that was a helpful thing in terms of my self-confidence. When it came to college, I really wanted to go to Yale. I'm not sure why. I think I knew one of the friends of my folks had gone to Yale, and I said, well, that must be a nice place, and it's easy to spell. I had B's and C's, but the guidance counselor said, well, you might consider Ohio Wesleyan University, of which I had never heard, but Ohio Wesleyan University took me, and I was very happy to be there. There were about 1,300 people there. The course that I took was pre-medical because I had declared that I wanted to be a surgeon, and pre-medical had a series of things to prepare somebody to go into medical school. So I was very fortunate that worked out and that I was able to get into medical school. I was fortunate to have been accepted by University of Rochester. I had a wonderful time in medical school. Again, I was leaning toward the surgical departments. Got myself into the surgical lab where they were doing experiments on various animals, and it was fun because every Friday they would have a clam bake, and they would put clams in the autoclave and then have a keg of beer. And so, it kind of drew me into the socialization aspect of hanging around with a bunch of surgeons. So the head of the Department of Surgery at that time was Seymour Schwartz, and he was very well regarded in academic circles, and he was writing a textbook of surgery, general surgery. And I was fortunate to have the opportunity to proofread some of his textbook prior to its publication. So after I graduated from medical school in 1971, moved to Hartford, Connecticut, where I was an intern at the Hartford Hospital. And in those days, one had what is called a rotating internship, 4 months of surgery, 4 months of medicine, 2 months of emergency room, and 2 months of obstetrics. And during that time, I happened to see with my wife the movie Little Big Man, which had Dustin Hoffman in it, and it was about Indians, and I became aware of the opportunity to spend time in the Indian Health Service. And over this period of time in medical school, my wife and I had been very interested in hiking and climbing and had traveled out west in our vacations near Glacier National Park. And I was lucky enough to get a position for 2 years in the Indian Health Service in Browning, Montana, which is just east of Glacier National Park. So this was a group of 5 physicians, one of whom had been trained as a pediatrician. The other 4 had only been trained as interns. So because I had had 4 months of surgical rotation, I became the chief of surgery. I had had 2 months of obstetrics, so I became the chief of obstetrics. When someone would come in, we had several textbooks, and we had a couple of people we could call. There was a surgeon that would come once a month and do a little surgery, and I would help him with that, but I was not by myself taking out gallbladders or anything. But in terms of obstetrics, you can't get anybody to come. It was 2.5 hours drive from any major city or any major hospital. The Indian Health Service couldn't afford helicopters, and the weather was so bad the helicopters probably couldn't have flown anyway. But I remember that, in some of the deliveries that I performed, I had to run around and do the epidural anesthesia and then come around and deliver the baby. But I wanted to do this in part to help out Native Americans, and also because I thought it would be helpful for me to spend some time in general practice preparation for a surgical career. When I finished with the Indian Health Service in Montana, then I applied and was accepted at Swedish Hospital in Seattle for my surgical residency. And during that time, I got somewhat interested in colon and rectal surgery. Well, at Swedish Hospital at that time, there were 2 colon and rectal surgeons in town. The colorectal surgeons were tolerated and objected to highly by the general surgeons who felt they could do everything just as well as the colorectal surgeons. So after a year at Swedish Hospital, I had an opportunity to go across the street to Virginia Mason Hospital, which was a different kind of an environment, even though they had no colorectal surgeons, and then was able to follow that up in 1978 by going to the Ferguson Clinic in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which was one of the top centers of training in colorectal surgery. And I got to the Ferguson Clinic and realized I knew nothing. So I was very pleased to not only realize my ignorance and my arrogance, but to have it corrected there in large part by the Ferguson Clinic. This was a private clinic, and they had a private hospital. And there were 5 colorectal surgeons who worked at that hospital. And similar to my training in general surgery at Virginia Mason, we were assigned to one surgeon at a time and would have the same experience seeing the patient before surgery, making decisions about surgery, doing the surgery, following up on that surgery. And Dr. Patrick Mazier, a former president of the ASCRS, was the chair of the residency program. John McKeegan, J.P. Muldoon, Manny Campos, they were wonderful people. They would have us to their home and, to their cottage, and really treated us as human beings as opposed to fellows. There were 5 fellows at that time at the Ferguson Clinic. Prior to leaving Seattle, I had investigated the possibility of joining Dr. Gary Lewis here in Seattle. So I said, do you need a partner? And he said, well, I can't pay you anything. I'll give you free office rent for 6 months. And you can go to the bank and borrow money, and we'll see how you do. That was an unusual thing for me. I was hoping, of course, to get a big salary. Went to see a banker and said, I'd like to have a loan. I'm going to start my medical practice. And they said, sure, sign here. So I showed up on July 1st, and I said, well, where's Dr. Lewis? And they said, well, he's on vacation. You're covering all of his patients. And at that point, I had no hospital privileges. I had no insurance. I had, very limited experience from my first year at Swedish about, where everything was. So anyway, we recovered from that, and we rented a house in Seattle for the time being, and then bought a house in Seattle. Colonoscopy was just starting. I had 25 colonoscopy cases that I did during my fellowship, and that was a big deal because that was more than anybody else in Seattle had, including the gastroenterologists. So they were starting with flexible sigmoidoscopy and then colonoscopy, and we, again, were still in the same model of patient treatment that had been going on for 20 years in general surgery. If somebody had diverticulitis, you would make an open incision, you would take out a portion of the colon. Several years later, we were at Swedish Hospital. There was an excellent general surgery residency, and we participated in the training of the general surgeons in our field. And one of them in particular was experienced a great interest in colorectal surgery. So we nurtured him and invited him to join us in practice, and he too went to Ferguson Clinic and came back and was a great asset. So then we had 3 in our practice, and he had a good friend a year behind him, so we had a 4th person in our practice. And so we had established a good 4-person practice and covered both Swedish Hospital downtown and another hospital up in the north part of Seattle, about 10 miles north, called Northwest Hospital. During the time at Swedish, we were working with general surgery residents and enjoying the teaching, and some of them became interested in colorectal. And at the same time, Dr. Goldberg and others were encouraging the beginnings of additional fellowships in colorectal surgery. And one of the requirements for that fellowship was that you had to have a minimum of 3 colorectal surgeons to teach. And finally, we got up to the minimum and followed Dr. Salvati and Dr. Goldberg's recommendations. One of our concerns was, well, if we train a colorectal surgeon, what happens if they park next door and take all of our patients away? And I remember Dr. Salvati saying, if you think that you, with your experience and many years of training, can't beat out someone who's just starting, you're nuts. So don't be worried about that, because it ain't going to happen.
'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna happen. 'Cause it ain't gonna ha
I joined ASCRS just to be a member of the club, in large part, but then became aware of the advantages of knowing people and having mentors, serial mentors of various kinds, and being a mentor for other younger surgeons. In 1982, Dr. Lee Smith, who had been in Washington, D.C. at Bethesda Medical Center for many years, came to Seattle and started in practice with Dr. Bill Friend. And in 1982, he invited me to lunch in the Pike Place Market. His message was, you could do very well in the ASCRS and go a long way, and you would be a great valuable person to be in the ASCRS and help with committees and that sort of thing. That inspired me to do more and volunteer more with ASCRS. In the mid-90s, laparoscopy was introduced, and someone finally was able to figure out how to remove an appendix with a laparoscope. Equipment companies wanted to get on this wave, assuming it was going to go somewhere. So they were training the general surgeons, particularly to do gallbladders and appendixes, and the ASCRS also trying to get them to put on courses for colon and rectal surgeons to figure out how to do laparoscopy and improve the care of the colon and rectal patient. So during that period of time, Lee Smith and I went to Ethicon and Covidien, which was then called U.S. Surgical, to try to convince these companies to put on courses for colon and rectal surgeons, which they ultimately did. At one of the early meetings, I was reading the journal Diseases of the Colon and Rectum, mentioned to the then editor that I wouldn't mind being on the editorial board. So he said, okay, fine, you're on the editorial board. And as time went on, our contract with the publisher of the journal was expiring and needed to be renewed. And so Dr. Robert Baird and I were somehow assigned to go and look at other publishers. And as a consequence of that, we changed publishers, and it greatly enhanced the revenue that was generated from the journal for the ASCRS. The board was always looking for a volunteer examiner or two every time they had the board exams, and I was invited to do that. After 3 or 4 years and working with the board, I was invited to be a member of the board, which I did for several years, and then ultimately finished my term as vice president of the board. My early days were just meeting people who were in my situation, who had only been in practice a year or 2 or 3, became friendly with these people and listened to what they were talking about, and became aware of those in the leadership of ASCRS, and they encouraged me to come into first being on the council, and then I was secretary for a couple of years, and then in 2002 was elected as president of the ASCRS. Early in the year of my presidency, the woman that was head of taking care of our organization administratively said, well, what are you going to talk about? Give me a title for your presidential address. I had no idea, but I thought about the 3 themes that have been important to me and named the address Serendipity, Humility, and Dumbo's Feather. I've been the recipient of much serendipity and accidental wonderful things that have happened. Humility is another thing that surgeons are not particularly known for, recognizing that the patient is first and the surgeon needs to, be humble and recognize the opportunity that the surgeon has to do good. And the Dumbo's Feather part was to discourage people from trying to do something for patient care because we've always done it that way. Often it takes 20 years for surgeons to make changes in their practices, even after a technique has been repeatedly demonstrated to be a positive thing. Around the time of my presidency, the society decided that they needed a website. And so the first thing that the society said, well, let's call it ASCRS.com. Well, they found out that that was the name of the website for the American Society of Cataract and Refractive Surgeons. So somebody said, if we say FASCRS, nobody had taken that name. But that was the beginnings of developing a website and then using the website for communication and teaching. computers were having a greater role in practice, as well as new diagnostic things like MRI scans instead of just CAT scans. And that also changed practice, and lots of research was being done and published in the diseases of the colon and rectum. We received many invitations, as did most presidents, to come to international meetings, and I was fortunate to be invited to go to Melbourne, where there was a tripartite meeting. Was able to go to Heidelberg and Hamburg to some general surgery meetings to be able to share our experience with our graduates and colorectal surgeons from other areas, some of whom were not as advanced as we were, or so we thought, some of whom were much more advanced than we were, and we took from them and learned from them. Dr. Terry Hicks, in his presidential address, made the statement that colorectal surgery is the best job in the world, and I would have to agree with that. It's helping people. It's curing disease. It's helping families who are otherwise impacted by their loved ones who have various terrible things. And it also gives you an opportunity to help others, mentor others, and have a reasonable lifestyle and go home as a happy guy that you have helped a whole bunch of people. My career fills me with pride and gratitude for having started out as a very shy kid and somehow moving into being more comfortable around people and having the opportunities that I have been afforded as a colon rectal surgeon and as a leader. I've been very blessed with the friends that I've made and still have after 40 years. I tell people we're coming today to the American Society of Colorectal Surgeons meeting in Seattle, and 2,000 of my best friends are coming here today, and I'm going to be very happy to see them.